welcome to Designing Adobe XD. I'm Hillary, your host today, and I'm here with Jess Moon. She's one of our newest members on the team. Jess, what do you do with XD?
Well, Hillary. So our team kind of focuses on the core tools, and we also focus on all the collaboration for the tools. And so I'm one of the design managers for that portion of it, and I basically talk to Hillary every day about random design-related things.
She told me not to say this, but she's my manager.
I knew you were going to do it. I can feel it coming out of you. Anyway.
Cool. Well, excited to have Jess on Designing XD. You may have seen her before on Adobe Live. Mm-hmm. She's an Adobe Live veteran.
Hi, everyone. Exposed. Hello, folks from Kenya and everyone else. Where is everybody coming from? Let's see. What time are we at? We're at noon here?
Yes.
In San Francisco. Cool.
Canada.
I want to go to Canada so badly.
No.
I'm planning a trip. But I think why not Canada? I'd love to go to Canada.
I've never been to Canada.
Oh.
So close.
And Mountain View. Heck yeah. LA. Very fun. I'm going to go to LA soon to go see my mom. Korean food. Ooh. She just came from there. She made me a bunch of vats of kimchi.
What?
Which was awesome.
It's like we have Nigeria and the Netherlands.
Netherlands, yep, very cool. Orlando, Paradise, very cool. And yes, Chris, I agree that Papa's last trip looked amazing. I was literally like, hey, can you tell me about what Peru was like? That was incredible looking. So, all right, well.
Cool. So what are we going to do today?
You tell me.
Okay. So we're going to take a look at components again real quick today, and then we're going to show you a little bit about how our team uses components. And then with whatever time we have left, Jess is going to design a feature for us.
And we don't actually know what feature. So if you have a suggestion for what I can whip out in 15 minutes or 10 minutes, feel free to throw it in the chat.
Yeah, so throw out your ideas in the chat. Jess will pick one of them, and we'll design it. Okay, so components. We've talked a little bit about them before on here, but I'm going to do just a quick refresh to start with. So components came out, I don't even know when now. It's
last release.
Two
releases ago.
Or 2 ago. I think it was May, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep.
So components, they're all about reusability. So if you save it as a component in your asset panel, you pull it out, you can reuse it throughout your designs and do quick updates. It's going to help you keep consistency, just generally work faster. Anything else I'm missing?
I mean, I think a component, we've been having a lot of conversations like what exactly can a component be, right? A lot of people see a color and they're like, that could be a component if you think about it, especially when you're linking those from other files. A component could be an object that you just reuse, like the button, that kind of thing. So there's all sorts of different ways of thinking about reusable elements like components. So
that's a good point. One of the things we're going to talk about is how you can collaborate using components and work across document. And we're going to show you a little bit about how we do that on our team. Okay, so just a quick refresh of how components work. I'm just going to build a quick button to start with.
Sure.
Okay. So we'll start with our rectangle, and maybe we'll give it some curve.
Oh, and people are just capturing some ideas for features to design.
Awesome.
Supporting drop shadow and blur and auto animate. Design a hover state feature. Well, I can't do that one because people have made good thoughts about that already.
Okay. Okay, so let's just bold that. So this is a giant button. And to add it as a component, I can either go ahead and do that in the asset panel here by hitting the plus sign, or I can use the keyboard shortcut, which is just Command K.
Are you a keyboard shortcut person, or are you a clicker, or what are you?
I'm somewhere in between. I have like a small set of keyboard commands that I
Yeah.
use all the time.
Okay.
But I definitely don't know all of them, and I'm not a pro at it. What about you?
I live off of keyboard shortcuts, actually. I was like,
No, I envy watching people who work
Yeah.
with them. You just work so fast.
I think it's partly because of, so I was like, looking at a puddle in life and thinking about like, why do I love keyboard shortcuts so much? And I think it kind of ties back to the fact that one, I used to play the piano a lot when I was a kid. So like, I love just kind of like that kind of memorization game. And I game. And so when you game, it's all about like actions per minute and like
Yes.
doing as much stuff as possible.
Gamers
So I think
are always good.
they're always
at
keyboard
commands,
shortcutters.
yes.
Yep.
Okay, so the first new thing you'll notice about components in comparison to our old model, which was called symbols, is that you will see some resize handles on it. So you can now do all kinds of resizing things. The other decoration you'll notice is that there is a diamond in the upper left-hand corner. So that's going to represent your master component. The master is going to control changes that propagate to your instances. So if I copy and paste this button, you'll notice that it doesn't have a diamond, meaning it's an instance. So any changes that I do to this master is going to propagate to all instances. We'll make a couple more real quick.
I think it's always so fun watching people do things. Like I was like seeing you resize the text. I always do it in the PI.
You do it in the PI?
Yeah, I do it in the PI.
Yeah. So I feel like in demos I do it here, but in real life I actually do it in the
PI too.
So again, you can see if I will do something in the PI, change the text. I'm going to use Jess's default font that she told me she uses.
That's my pro tip for you. It's like when you don't want to use Helvetica and you want to use something that's probably on your system and you're on a Mac, that looks good. Just use Avenir.
So you see those changes propagated to all instances. Now I'm going to go ahead and change the color of one of these. We'll do a blue.
It's beautiful.
And if I go ahead and change this, you'll notice that the color is changing on the instance where I didn't make an override, but not on the instance where I did make an override. So that's one kind of change. Those are just style changes. Another change that you can do is actually a resize change. So actually, let's do this one. I'm going to move it down here. I'm going to resize this one. Now you'll see if I go back to the master, only the instance that I didn't change is updating.
Yeah. I think that understanding, like, I think when you're just like in the moment and you're designing stuff, like you're like, okay, let me just make a button that makes sense. Just a little bit more foundational thinking of like how that object is structured and what the properties are is really, really helpful to think about when you plan for overriding stuff, which is exactly what you're showing. Like, I think like the secret sauce more than keyboard shortcuts is just thinking about like what are the properties that you want to just be flexible and what are the properties that you want that are not flexible. And so size, is definitely an example of it. Alignment or color, these are all things that you're like, okay, what's the things that ultimately matter? Those live in the master and then everything else is, overrides.
When you get to more complicated components, I think one of the more valuable features to really spend time understanding is responsive resize and how to set up your constraints. It will really help with the flexibility of resizing these components, and we can talk a little bit more about that in a second. I'm going to just show one other kind of override, that you can do that's different than symbols. So with symbols, whenever you added an object, it would update and add to all instances. Now I've made this bigger. I want to like add in an icon of some sort. We're just gonna add in a ellipse right now. So imagine this is some kind of icon.
It's an ellipse icon.
Yeah. So now I've added in this, but everything else is still in sync in here. So, and I can even go ahead and remove things. So if I move this, I don't know why I would want to do that. Everything else is still in sync.
Yeah, because none of those things have been overridden in any way or changed.
Exactly.
Yeah. You could also, instead of an icon, so like one thing we do in the UI kit actually that we have for when we design stuff in XD is we have nested components.
Yes.
So you can basically turn, instead of like, Hillary made that kind of static vector shape, but you could actually theoretically just make like you always know your icons live in a 40 by 40 area, and then and make that a component, and then in which case you could swap out any number of icons you want in that component, and that's that component in your button, your cool button with an icon. And then now you have separate sort of organization for those.
Yeah, so I can show a little bit of that when I show you kind of how our team sets up our document and some best practices on things like that. So the last thing, I'll just show maybe nesting these into a modal or something. So I'll start with my frame and then...
Gotcha. What if I delete the master?
We can show that as well.
You right click and then it unveils all, including the
I'm really
master.
into these bright colors right now.
I was like, you're really into these like nice like sea foam, like really warm, summery colors, Peruvian colors.
Okay, so here we have a modal. I'm gonna go ahead and I'll use this instance, bring it to the front, make it a little bit smaller here. And then maybe I'm gonna just use a rectangle as my font right now. Let's just do white. This is gonna be our placeholder for our title. And then maybe we'll have some, okay, this is where I'm gonna go with the PI. And we'll do a repeat grid.
Look at all those pro keyboard shortcuts you're doing. Like,
I should tell you guys which ones they are when I'm doing it, huh? Okay, so I have this pretend modal, and I'm going to make this a component. So this is kind of what I was talking about when I think this is where I feel like it's important to understand your constraints. So as I expand this, you can see, actually, I'm gonna make this not a repeat grid right now, just to keep it simple.
Oh yeah.
As I expand this, you'll see, you can see the constraints and how it's responding. So all of the things with the pink line is showing you which side it's constrained to. Now, if I go ahead and change a constraint on something, for example, if I go ahead and change it here and move it in the master, why is it not updating? Right now,
There's an instance. Isn't that the instance?
Oh, this is the instance.
Actually, they want to know how to get to the master, so you just right click on show them.
So there we go. If you want to get to the master, right click, edit master.
And it either locates the master on the document if it's already in existence, and if it's not in existence, it pulls up the instance for you.
Okay. Glad we solved that problem. All right, so if I change the constraints on this, you're gonna see things jump around. So for this, I probably wanna have it docked to the right and probably aligned. The left. But that's kind of the importance of understanding your constraints and how things are gonna move around when you start messing with the layout.
Yeah, I think like you have to kind of think about it a little bit more. So like right now, for example, you kind of think about it as like objects, right? So it's like the green and the white right there, they're all kind of sharing one bucket of like magical objects. And then the second thing you have is this new dude who's like button, and they're different. So like one is a family that's just not even grouped. They're kind of separated in their own hierarchy. They're just kind of there. So that's why they will resize that way, which is obvious, and then the button itself is this other kind of foreign object, and you want to make sure that you're like, hey, you need to like be friends with this object that way. And so when you start thinking about it that way, you start to naturally group things basically in a way that you want them to say, you're a cluster of stuff here, you're a cluster of stuff here, and this is how you cluster together, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Cool. So that's kind of an overview of components. Again, Gayatri, to your point, if you delete your master, it's no big deal. You can also just select an instance, right click, edit master component, and we'll regenerate it for you.
Yep.
You can also do that in the PI here, edit master component, and it will take you to that. Okay. So now we're just quickly going to take a look at how our team sets up our UI document, and we all share this as a team and work from this. So we'll just take a quick look at it and talk about some best practices for that. So the first thing when you come into the document that you'll see is that it tells you when it was last updated and who did the updates.
Yeah.
And then you'll also see some best practices here. So it just says basically to add content to here when it's final, update the thumbnail to when it was updated, and to make sure everything is made into a component so that people can link to it. And if you add a design exploration, just to note it as an exploration.
This is like our master build. So, and I think that's a really interesting way. Like if you work on a design team of like more than yourself, and you're starting to think of like, how do you keep your new systems like up to date and organized? This is a really interesting thing because we have basically a very clear place that says like, this is the person who made the update, so anyone could like Slack that person and be like, hey, what's broken? What did you break?
Yeah.
What did you not break?
Where did this go?
Yeah, and then the README is also helpful because, like we had a discussion about this like in the team. We're like, hey, like how do we, if we're working on future things versus now, like how do we keep that in sync? When do we keep it in sync? That kind of stuff, so.
And Tim, yes, you can update a master's name. You can do it here in the component. Well, actually, you have to go to list view, and then you can go in here and rename a component's master, and it will also update the instances.
Yep. Yeah.
So, so then what we have here is we have a page for styles. You'll see we start adding some of our components in here. So, for example, the selection decorations are here, the repeat grid, even components. Some of the prototyping assets, and then we even have our app frame, we have our toolbar, and I'm actually going to link to this document in the previous document so I can kind of start to show you how we work with some of these, and we can start swapping out some nested symbols. Cool, so where did my other document go? Here it is. Okay, so I'm gonna delete these. And up here in the asset panel, there's this plus sign that says link assets. So, hey there, Talon. Looks like Talon
hi.
just popped in. I'm gonna go ahead and select this UI kit, and it's going to link to this document. There, so now I have all of these assets in here. So I can actually start building out an app frame, for example. I can type that in here, and now I have our app frame.
They're so well named.
Yeah.
It's
so
actually ridiculous how well named they are.
That's definitely something that is really helpful. If you can give everything like really well searchable names, it will make everything much faster, and you can search for it up here. So now
asks, what is the best way to name your components? Thinking face.
That's a good question. So here, I think what we have is, if I look at our components, so here's like some of the icons that we use. So it just has the icon name. And then I think as you get to more complicated ones, it will actually use, for example, here we have This is the prototype home button with the hover state, prototype home with the active state, and prototype home with the inactive state.
Yeah, I think that when components, I think if you put on the hat of like, what if a new person who started on your team was looking for a component, what would they search? Kind of like Google term, but component, like as like to Talon's point, like descriptive as possible, because I think if you just start naming them like nested thing of nested thing, it's like what? Yeah. But you could pretty much just kind of treat the search in our assets panel like Google, where you're like, I need blah, blah, blah. And then it actually does magically, Carmen named them all perfectly. They're all perfectly named. Yeah. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so let's just quickly show nested symbols. So one of the ones that I love here, so if I'm trying to, layers, let's see. If I'm trying to build out my layers panel, I can, here we go. Nope, that's not it. Had it earlier. Do you see the layers?
What are you looking for specifically?
Okay, what I'm gonna do, because I know where it is, I'm gonna pull it from the document here.
I mean, that's a really interesting point. I think it was Ben or someone who was asking about finding things through the assets panel. And I always say that's a really interesting discussion because you would typically try to find it in the assets panel, but I'm actually the type of person that likes to have the other linked document open.
Yes.
Because I just remember where it was mapped as on the artboard, and I just am like, I always have it, like, the document open on the side.
I think both are super helpful.
I agree. I think sometimes, like, especially your quick ones, like, they're super handy, you know where to find it, you know to type in for the assets panel, but especially for designing stuff you don't, like, for the first time or, like, you haven't done it in a while, I tend to just leave that linked document open because I know in general there's an artboard that's kind of dedicated to it, and I find it there.
And that's why we have the two flows. You can copy and paste selected ones, and you can also link the entire document if you're someone who likes to just search for it in the asset panel. But so here I have components actually nested into a repeat grid. And the cool thing with nesting components into a repeat grid is that I can now do overrides in a repeat grid. So I'm actually going to zoom in here and select this and say, okay, I want this to be an object instead of or a component instead of a folder. I can actually select this and swap it out. So now you can do any kind of nested symbols with overrides, replace anything. Yeah. So it makes it super easy to just work fast, make those changes as you're updating your designs.
Yeah, and it's all aligned and everything, so it just fits perfectly in there. And what you don't know, but they're also related, is like the global colors there are also linked. So like one day if you wanted to not make everything grayscale in that left asset panel and you wanted to make it, you know, hot rod red or something, you could do that and it would actually just cascade it into there.
Exactly, yeah.
Yep.
Cool, so that's how our team works with our linked assets.
It's exciting.
So we only have a few minutes
I was
left.
say, I don't think I can bust out a feature in 7 minutes. I can certainly try, but that'll be like a record feature.
Do you want to try, or should we look at a few more examples?
I'll just look at a few more examples.
Okay, sounds good. All right. So let's take a look at what else we have in the UI kit. So we can go a little bit more in depth. So here is some instances of our property inspector. So you can see here, if I zoom in on the responsive resize part, you have the disabled state, you have the auto state, and the manual state. And so now if I want to use these in my designs and say, for example, I want to like change what the constraints are in my designs, I can make those overrides through components. And then you know, for appearances, you know, you may have things that you want, depending on the state of what object is selected, that are shown or not shown. So, you know, if you have border selected, we have a state here that has, you know, what all of those different controls for border state are. what else do we have in here? We have some file menu types. So if you need to add in a new menu item, we can quickly do that.
It's interesting. It's like the file menu stuff is always an interesting conversation too, because like you would think that something like a systems level like menu is not something that we talk about too much, but that in and of itself is like conversations of like, you know, how do you create like a nested sort of drop down? How do you like decide that that's in the file menu versus you know, on the canvas versus like in a right click menu? Like all those kind of interactions, like as a newer person here, I'm always just fascinated that we're talking about making deliberate choices of where you're putting that contextual thing relevant to kind of where that action is, right? Yeah. So like to the point of like seeing the master, there was a conversation going in the chat where it was like, well, how do you see the master? It's like, well, it's not just one place, right? Like you're on an instance probably, that's the use case, and you want to see the master. You might be the type of person who's like on the canvas where you want to see it, so a right click makes sense for you there. And we have a UI that unveils that, and we add those options there. Yeah. And then you might be an assets person, like you're like on the panel and you're like, I want to see it in the assets panel. That's what Skytree was saying, where she's like, I just right click on it and unveil it in there. So yeah, it's
a good point. You know, and another decision we have to make is like, when does it make sense to introduce a control and where? And so, you know, we've started with the right click, but as a lot of you know, we have alluded to states. So you may see more controls actually in the PI when we have something like states.
Indeed. So yeah. And then Ben asked, like, do you have a dedicated person on your team to keep your files clean and organized? Everybody pitches in. I think that every now and then there's like a spring cleaning. And the recent one was when we had our newest update to components from Symbols. And we did have one person who is more involved with the tooling part, who she just kind of practically took the lead and did it and made it magical. Like we came back in the office on a Monday and we're like, it's so different. Like Marie Kondo just entered your life and just sparkled it up. But yeah, so we did have that. But then we have in our workflow when we're about to like develop the product and release that feature that that person is responsible for going into here and updating that. So everyone has it. So
yeah, exactly. But yeah, and like as we mentioned in the beginning, the whole team is responsible for contributing to this UI kit, and so we have those best practices when you first come into the file of just, you know, how to update it, when to update it. So we all try to help. But yeah, so going back to kind of what I showed with nested symbols, we've actually made each of our icons into a component, which makes it super easy to do that component swapping that I showed for the layers panel.
I think that's actually one of the most simple things that anyone could just pick up out of like watching us right now. Is like, make your icons components, period. You make your icons, if you start thinking about making icons components, and like those are the easiest kind of atomic elements to think of, honestly. I think more than buttons actually, because they're usually bound to a square or something. Yeah. So make them components and start swapping those things out. It's pretty magical when you do that.
Yeah. Let's see, any other last things we want to take a look at?
Yeah.
Let's see, this is a interesting one here. We've got our color pickers, which I think are super fun. You can change the gradients with overrides, which is super awesome.
It's like 1 minute.
I don't want to mess it up in this document at the moment.
That's true.
But yeah, oh, and here's a nice one that I actually use a lot. We have a presentation slide set up.
We do.
So that makes it really easy to just get started with presentations and, you know, not start from a blank canvas.
Which is, and to clarify, like you just copy paste the artboard into whatever you want and it automatically links, so it's great.
Yeah. All right, that's it. Thanks for joining, everyone.
Yep, have a great rest of your, what is today, Friday? Weekend.